Hi, Father Ian Van Heusen here. We're here with Rob Agnelli, and we're going to be talking today about prudence. And to kind of introduce it a little bit, hopefully this isn't too self-conscious, and I'm trying to not be self-conscious myself about it. What was the biggest mistake you can safely share, or just a mistake, a funny mistake that you made?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Well, I'll talk about mine, and then we'll just talk about
maybe something else.
There we go. Okay. Let's jump in. All right. The funniest thing with teaching, when you're teaching, you're always just one day ahead of the students. So at times, you get something wrong or whatever. And there was twice that I got lessons wrong. Once I was teaching 5th grade math. And with when you're first learning math, you have to learn when it's a longer equation, you learn what order you do things in correctly.
PEMDAS,
exactly. I got that wrong. And the principal was in the room. I'm getting the 5th grade math wrong. And I got the whole lesson wrong, and I had to redo the lesson the next day. He was really gracious about it, but it was pretty embarrassing. Those first year of teaching, when you get something wrong, I was an English major too, so I was teaching at a Catholic school. But the one thing I've learned is, what is the one quality of prudence? How do we become prudent? It's when we make mistakes and we learn from them. It's just the fruit of experience.
Yeah.
And some people, maybe they didn't make less. Actually, I think everybody makes mistakes in one way or another. Maybe the proud and the arrogant, they don't admit their mistakes, or they're not able to reflect on them. But that's really how we become prudent, right?
Yeah, it's funny because I'm a high school baseball coach, and one of the things that I have to emphasize with the boys, because they're at an age where they're not that confident in themselves, or a little self-conscious, right? Is if you make a mistake and I point it out, I just want you to learn from the mistake so you don't make it again.
Exactly.
Right? I don't, I'm not keeping a report card going, man, Joe really stinks. Here's 7 things he does wrong. But the importance of early on owning your mistake, and that's why sports is really good for young boys, right? You own your mistake, and then you just move on from it, right? And the better you do that, the better player you tend to be, because you're not dwelling on what already happened. And because especially in baseball, the ball has a way of finding you when you're like that. And it's really important to be able to learn how to admit when you're wrong, mostly because if you're honest with yourself, that's how you avoid the mistakes in the future.
Well, and you picked on something about learning from mistakes. And I'd be curious now, I almost want to go back and read Aquinas to see if he covers this. I bet he does in one way or another, maybe But one of the things that prevents you often from learning from mistakes is being overly self-conscious, or the people who often grow are the people who are I made a mistake. No big deal, let's move on. And then as leaders, when leaders have that mentality in their business, you made a mistake, move on. And that's reinforced. But the opposite of that, you see it with sports very clearly. If you're afraid of making mistakes as an athlete, you're never going to go anywhere, right?
Yeah, and some of that too is just learning how to not take yourself so seriously, right? Like Chesterton, the Angels, they fly because they take themselves so lightly, right? And having a sense of humor about failure is really good and healthy, and that little bit of self-deprecation, and then you don't expect so much of yourself, and you learn from your mistakes, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. So I'm trying to think, do you know, what does Aquinas get into the definition of prudence? I should have looked this up before. Do you have an idea of how Aquinas...
I don't remember the exact wording he uses, but it's essentially knowing the right thing to do at the right time in the right way, right? The 3 conditions of... And so prudence is really, it's not, it tends to be, we think of someone's a prude, right? They're really reserved, they don't do anything, but the prudent man knows when to act, how to act, and the right amount of and in that way it's his, he uses as a bridge between the intellect and the will, right? Where it's really kind of an intellectual virtue, the knowledge, but then the intellect's got to command the will to do it.
Absolutely. Now I'll give an example. Hopefully this isn't too hard on this priest, but I think this is a good example. So I would add to that prudence is the science of circumstances. Weighing circumstances.
Yeah, that's a good point.
No situational awareness, things like that. I'm sure we could probably pull this out of Aquinas if we kind of teased it out a little bit, but I'm sure, because Aquinas covers most things, very few things that he doesn't cover. I mean, technically, he even covers emotional intelligence. For years, I didn't realize he covered emotional
Well, it's
intelligence.
amazing. Like as soon as I have a question, I go like, this is probably somewhere in the summary or the like. I just found out about the sentences, right? Like his commentary on the sentences has everything in it. It was amazing.
Oh, does it really?
Yeah, it's amazing. It's the first time I've really like looked into it.
Is that available in English?
Yeah, online it is now. Someone has translated. I think it's the first 4 books of it. I think there's 5 total.
Yeah,
and they're all in English.
Well, Ligori's, his moral theology has just been made available in English too. So anyways, we're geeking out a little bit. Totally.
Two geeks.
So where the heck was I going with this? So, so there's this situation. I don't want to be too hard on the priest, but the priest, he got up at a funeral. It was a suicide. And he basically said, he gave this church's teaching on mortal sin and how to commit suicide is a mortal sin. And you put your soul in danger and, things like that. And that's obviously an example of not being prudent, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
for sure.
So like some people, this is where right now we're losing a sense of prudence, especially folks who are more in agreement with the church. It's not just saying the right thing, but it's also saying it at the right time and in the right circumstances, right?
Yeah, and I think that is a real challenge now when, for the most part, there's a lot of silence in the church on things that should not be silent, right? We'll just leave it at that. People then imprudently think, well, I've got to go tell this, immediately. In fact, there was a situation today with some students I know where somebody was upset about the way something liturgically was being handled. And then they decided not only to talk about that, but then to jump on the gay marriage bandwagon, right? Like all at once, like it had nothing to do with what was being talked about, right? But it just happened to be that was what he wanted to say. And so it turned a whole bunch of people against him. And he didn't say anything untrue, but it was imprudent for sure.
And it just derailed the whole situation.
Yeah, so knowing where the limits are, and that, again, that's like kind of knowing where a person is, right? Like gradualism. Right? Like gradually moving people, that takes a lot of prudence.
We'll talk about that a little bit. So St. John Paul II, he talks about the distinction between the law of gradualism versus the gradualism of the law. So the law of gradualism is people convert and are led towards the law slowly. That's not to be confused with gradualism of the law. The law is still the law. The teachings are still objective. They're still clear. But we're working people towards that, right?
And some of that is, there are certain hard teachings, right, that people aren't ready for, right? But I mean, especially when it comes to evangelization, like if I can show them Jesus and they can trust Jesus, this is why I love John 6, right? Where Peter, he's like, I don't understand anything you just said about the Eucharist, but you have the words of eternal life. So it's total trust in Jesus. And if the church says, Jesus says to the church this, then I'm going to believe it, right? But if we tend to go towards the hard teachings first, it's a little bit difficult to move someone to conversion because we forget, like, okay, yeah, the truth has a power all its own, but we're trying to be instruments of conversion, which does require us to, move people along slowly, right? And when there's, like I said, the silence and that is really difficult to do because we feel like I've got to tell them the truth. I've got to tell them the truth.
Absolutely. Here's and tied with that. Here's a good example of being prudent with a conversation. Is Jesus with the scribes and the Pharisees. When they ask him direct questions, the way he answers sometimes, right? He doesn't give a black or white answer. He's very prudent and very wise in how he handles. So I think the one with the paying the taxes, right? It's so great. Yeah. They're trying to trap him. They don't really care what he has to say. They're like, are you either with us or are you for Caesar? And then his response is so prudent and so wise. And he could have fleshed that out more. But the way he did it, the succinctness of it, the imagery, it just silenced everybody.
Yeah, because in Prudence, he knows where he wants to go. Right? That's also the prudent man. He knows where he wants to go with what he's doing or saying or whatever, right? And so he has a specific plan in mind for the Pharisees. He has a specific plan in mind for all of us. But in a certain sense, like that's a part of prudence is, wait, what's my goal here? What am I moving the person towards? Rather than just beating them over the head with something that's true.
Yeah, that is a good point, which is what is the war versus trying to win the battle, right?
That's a great image. That's a great image.
Yeah, because sometimes people with social media or whatever, they one-up you, or you one-up somebody, or you zing them, or you love a funny meme and you just whatever. And and maybe there's a time and a place for that, but there's also, sometimes you got to be strategic in how you present things or how you present yourself publicly, right?
Yeah, and that's the thing, again, going back to Jesus, right? Jesus doesn't care about winning an argument, he wants to win a soul, right? Like, that's how he beats his enemies. He doesn't beat them by like bludgeoning them, he beats them by winning them. And that's like the ultimate like prudent man.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So learning from mistakes, we talked a little bit about evangelization. I'm trying to think of another topic with prudence because we got a little bit more time here. Trying to think if we've missed something with prudence. Do you think we've missed anything?
We could certainly talk about just practical.
Examining your conscience, right? Just looking at what you're doing and why you're doing it. I talk about that a lot.
Yeah, that's a great example of prudence, right? A really good, like what the examine really is, right? Is to go back into those situations throughout the day and actually try to like reinvestigate them through the eyes of prudence, where we go, oh, what was God really trying to do here? What was I trying to do, and why weren't those two things aligned? Yeah. Right?
Exactly. And a lot of times we try to avoid looking at the things that we've done wrong or try to be circumspect about it. But it's interesting that with the examination of conscience it was funny. I was talking once with somebody. I said, oh, do you know the 7 deadly sins? And they're like, oh, I don't like to focus on the negative. It's like, no, but it's like you guard your heart by examining. So St. Ignatius, he gives 3 strategies for overcoming a desolation. So there's cycles of consolation and desolation. One is prayer, like vocal prayers. Another is meditation, and we could flesh those things out. The third that I found interesting is examining your conscience. And he gives 3 ways of examining your conscience. There's the examine prayer, where you go through your day. There's the particular examination, where you focus on one thing and you keep track of it during the day. And then there's meditating on the 10 commandments and the 7 deadly sins. And there is something about when you have the ideal before your gaze and you've internalized these things, you act prudently because you've internalized the truth. You've internalized who Jesus Christ is in a deeper way. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think what you're bringing out, like a lot of spiritual warfare is prudence, right? Like where I have to separate out the 3 enemies. Right?
Yeah.
I have to separate out, okay, is this the flesh, the devil, or the world, or is it a little bit of all 3, right? And St. Ignatius is trying to get us with desolation, trying to get us to recognize the voice of the enemy and reject it immediately, right?
Exactly.
But I got to move all of my garbage out of the way so that I go, okay, wait, that's just like I'm drawn to low and earthly things because you know what, I'm kind of low and earthly, right? Like I really like the idea of the comfort. It has little to do with the enemy, right? But being able to then prudently look at circumstances and then I can go, oh wait a second, hold on, like I'm actually being drawn because this is the voice of the enemy, and then you go to the end of the rules, right, and you do the 3 things that he suggests, right?
And prudence in this regard, and you're right, is intimately interconnected with discernment of spirits and with your conscience, obeying your conscience. And there are kind of 3 ways of looking at it. Prudence is the virtue that regulates things, and prudence regulates all the other virtues. Discernment of discernment of spirits, discerning the Holy Spirit from the enemy, is that kind of interior look and listening interiorly. And then conscience is kind of a little bit another topic, but it's this idea of doing what you think is right and following that inner voice of reason. So I have an interesting way of putting decision making, and I think you'll enjoy this, is that there's 2 kinds of decisions. There's what I call baseball decisions and golf decisions. Yeah, so golf decisions.
The baseball ones are better, right?
Well, no, they're both.
Go ahead, sorry.
But the thing with baseball is you have to decide in a split second. So what is virtue and prudence is training your heart so much that in an instant you're able to do the right thing. Versus the golf decision is where you line it up and you have time to think about it. Yeah. You need both.
Like that's a great image too. And I think it's also worth talking about, like, just understanding, like there's the supernatural gift of prudence too, right? Where we know how to use the thing.
Or called counsel as well.
Yeah, use the thing well for salvation, right? Which is ultimately what we're trying to get operating under that, right?
Yeah, we didn't touch upon that, how the gifts or the virtues are fulfilled in the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Yeah, that we have to cover that in the future, maybe not today, but that's an interesting teaching on how that works. But we're about out of time, so this is giving a little bit of an introduction. Like we were kind of hinting at, there's more to be discovered, with how Aquinas integrates the virtues with the gifts. But this was, I think, a good start, and I think this is going to be the beginning of a lot of conversations we're going to be doing next. The theological virtues, faith, hope, and love. So stay tuned in the future for those. Thanks, Rob.
Enjoyed it.